My life has been shaped in a lot of ways by water, especially calm, flat water. Church is probably the number one influence to make me, me. Whether it's from early days of Sunday school, going on to work in church camps and seminary and internships in churches and eventually here. Church has really done the most to make me, me. But number two, second place, calm, flat water. If you want to know anything about my growth to here, it's going to come in rowing. Rowing is that sport, you see it on the Olympics sometimes, skinny boats, tall people, long oars going backwards. Some of you have seen it there. Some of you have seen it in Boston. Has anyone ever tried rowing in here? A couple of you, okay. Well, for my rowing friends who are listening online, if you get nothing else out of this sermon, we're going to get this straight. Rowing is nothing to do with canoeing, nothing to do with kayaking. We never go row, 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 row. And this silly thing that people do with their arms has nothing to do with rowing at all. It takes holy patience for me when people do this to me. Think what I do. Actually, it's your legs. You push your legs to the extreme. You give out all your lungs that you have into extreme pain. You do it over and over, balancing in grace together with other people, which sounds a little bit like the church to me, but we try to do that on calm, nice water. When there's a little bit of wave on the water, it can knock off our balance, because it's skinny, skinny boats. If there's a little bit of wind, it might knock off our rhythm, because we're all trying to row at the same time. You can imagine riding a bicycle and the ground underneath you just starts shifting and waving. How do you keep your balance in that? So we like our lives to run smoothly. Rowers like their boats to run smoothly along the water. We don't like disruptions in our life. They take us out of routines. They make it harder for us to work together as people. When our lives are calm, we can forget how natural it is to manage our responsibilities and interact with others. But when water gets messy, we lose this sense of control. Who knows what's going to happen? Back in about 2000, one of the Olympic bids was down in Tampa, Orlando. They were trying to win the Olympics. And so some people asked me to help out to put on a show of a bunch of rowers so that they could choose the venue. And we were waiting for the buses to get there. And right when we hear the word, like, all the World Olympic people are there, we all start rowing really hard, and a jet ski goes by, and I catch one little wave, and I flip over, and Tampa never got the Olympics, and I blame myself. A disruption takes us out of our lives. I started rowing in college, 17 years old, and 5 a.m. do not mix very well, so I missed 3 of the first 5 practices. An auspicious start. But Coach Hess needed just another body, just another warm body to sit in the boat and make it move. And eventually, I started to pick up a thing here and there. And eventually, I started to enjoy the sport. And eventually, it took all season until we could beat the varsity women. We were really, really slow as freshman boys. But eventually, we got there, and I could feel a good stroke here and a good stroke there, and I fell in love with this sport. Rowing gave me my best friends in college, and when our coach left from college, my best friend and I, we were rowers. We said, we want to keep doing this, so we moved to England, which opened up so many opportunities. Any 20-year-old who's gone to do a grand tour across Europe, you know it changes your life. The sport has given me fitness and health. It's given me joy, definitely some of the best memories of my life. And maybe this will sound strange to people who aren't athletic, but when I was training for the national team, it gave me a purpose in my life. It gave me a direction and a goal, and I could control my whole life focused on getting up and what I ate and what I did and who I trained with. Eventually, it gave me a career in coaching, and that brought me to Boulder. And that time in Boulder eventually brought me to look at coming up here to Nederland, and eventually that brought me to here. And so rowing played quite a part in my story of coming here. For you, it might be family, it might be a different career, it might be a love of outdoors, whatever it is. Most of us have a fond story that shapes who we are. And you can think, what is it in your life, fond story that shapes who you are? But on the other hand, there were times in my rowing career when I was a hyper-competitive jerk. And I don't like that part of my story, but it is part of who I was. And years ago, I had a stress fracture in my back. broke my back rowing, and I had surgeries, and I had rehabs, and I spent 6 years in lots of pain. Many of you know that kind of a story. The day that I accepted that I would retire from rowing, I had to walk across the bridge on the Charles River. And I don't want to compare it too much to death, but it felt like that to me. I looked out to what I'd lost, and I looked out almost like it was taunting me. I had to walk across that bridge every day, and I would second-guess my decision. I would second-guess my purpose. I would feel sorry for myself sometimes. Sometimes I would ignore my limitations, and that would come back to bite me. And for you, it might be family. For you, it might be health or loss or whatever it is. But we all have terrible stories that shape who we are today. I could tell you a pure story, a story about joy and teamwork and success and overcoming trials and beauty. And there is something so meditative, almost spiritual, about getting up in the morning through the mist and cutting through the mist as the sun rises, when many people are on a boat focused on a goal greater than themselves. Or I could tell you a story about pain and heartache and failure and depression and mean coaches and bad teammates, all of which drew me distinctly away from anything that resembled spirituality in my life. Both of those stories are true because both of those stories shaped who I am, who it is to be me. And I share that with you particularly today. Stories of darkness and light through the water for a number of reasons. Obviously, we've seen a terrible amount of water flow through this town, cause so much damage. And we wonder, where is the good news through this? Where is the good news in Jamestown? We can manage the inconvenience here. We have enough bread at B&F. We have gas. But where is the good news in those canyon communities? And of course, our lives, all of us, we have darkness, we have light, we have joy, we have despair. In our regular experience, in our relationships, in our private moments of reflection, we are always comparing two narratives. And we know they're both true. And that can press against our faith. Even for those of us who are quite lucky in life, even for those of us who are just gifted with a happy outlook, where is the good news in our lives of this pendulum between grace and emptiness? And of course, the Bible is full of stories about water. Life-giving water. Waters of justice. Waters of baptism. But also stories of tears. And stories of floods. And stories of droughts. And the story I chose today from the Gospel of Matthew, Wes just read a moment ago. Little background. Before that story happened, Jesus had this slightly older cousin named John. We call him John the Baptist. He's a weird guy. We all have that weird guy in our family. If you don't have that weird guy in your family, you might be that weird guy in your family. Jesus and John seem to be pretty close, and eventually the authorities, they execute John violently and publicly. Here's a verse 13 from Matthew, right after the execution. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. To think that Jesus didn't deal with the same pains and emotions that we do is to miss something very important about God and about faith and about ourselves and about how all that comes together. Jesus suffered. And you have to think that a loss like that, someone close to him, shaped who he was. But he doesn't have time to grieve in this time. The crowds follow him, and so he heals them, and he teaches them, and he feeds them. This is where the feeding of the 5,000 happens, right here. 5,000 people that he helps while he is hurting from a deep personal loss. And they loved him. And so you have to believe their appreciation and seeing them share their food together. That had to shape him as well. But still, he tries to go off on his own. He barely has time. And his friends, his closest friends, are in crisis once again. Waves and wind batter their boat. The disciples trust him enough to pray, but don't trust him enough to believe he would respond. I think many of us have been there. Peter answered Jesus, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come out to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come on." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. Wes mentioned this is the story where Jesus walks on the water. This is the story where Peter walks on the water. At this point in the history of the world, up till now, the only person other than Jesus who has ever walked on water is redneck fisherman Peter. ADD, potty mouth Peter, who always does what he wants to do before he thinks about it, and he just pops out on the water. And for a while, he's walking. For a while, he has control over the forces around him. For a while, even though he's probably grieving for John, he's wondering about what John's death means to him and his friends. He's wondering, how is Jesus dealing with all this all the time? He's worrying for the well-being of his best friend. Imagine Peter, for the rest of his life, telling the story of that moment. One chance to do something amazing, something that no one's ever done before, and he walked on water. He would tell people, I knew Jesus. I knew Jesus back in the day. And in fact, Peter was the first person in history to recognize that Jesus was the Christ. And then eventually, Peter was the one who was given leadership to take over the church after Jesus died. And at this dramatic moment, life had come to this meaningful point of trust, and he had a faith. Peter, of all people, had a faith that could work wonders. Next sentence. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. And he cried out, Lord, save me. Peter, turns out, is like every other person in the world, just like you. You sink. For all the support he had of great friends, for all the responsibility that Jesus places on him, Peter gets scared and he forgets how to trust God in that crisis. Now imagine Peter again, the way he told that story the rest of his life. Such a painful memory. When it came down to this meaningful moment, when Jesus reached for him, he failed. He failed later in life when he denied Jesus 3 times. He failed later in life on the beach when Jesus came and said, take care of all these people. And he said, I don't know how. It is a shame he had, I'm sure, his whole life of unfulfilled potential. There's nothing more natural to our human experience than being a mix of significance and emptiness. We are always just one perspective away from telling a story of beauty and of grace and of purpose, or of telling a story of fear and despair and of anger. Crises, like the one we had in this week, they force us to name that perspective. Are we optimistic? Do we find the best in life? Or are we cynical and complain about when the waters pour over us? At these acute moments that happened here on the 11th of September, or acute moments that happened years ago on the 11th of September, we realize a fragility in life. We understand what can happen to our neighbors or to ourselves. And when we sit helpless to control anything about floods, it's natural to worry and to question and to plead and to be angry with God. And yet at moments of crisis, the other story is that we watch the triumph of courage. And we feel called to do something. This week we watched a community center transform into a shelter. As I understand, there wasn't even a sign-up list. People just showed up to help. And enough people showed up to help. Even the basement flooded. They kept coming. We heard about the National Guard rescuing hundreds of people. So many. Apparently this is the largest helicopter rescue we've had since Katrina in our little neighborhood. Many of you offered help and prayer through all of this. And in these moments of crisis, it's absolutely natural to ask God for our own safety and to work for the comfort of others and to live in the hope that we can overcome this. So I can tell you a story about life being alone and cold and helpless and dangerous and dark and inhospitable, where we will make mistakes and forget to trust. And I could tell you a story of life together and hopeful and redemptive and full of light and full of opportunity, and both of those to some degree are true. But neither of them, even when we tell both stories, neither of them get to the whole truth, to this place, to that book. What I've told you so far is just a story. But the good news, the Christian perspective, does not fall on this spectrum of optimism and cynicism. This is your takeaway. Faithful living, not just optimism. Faithful living is a hope that pervades all of our experiences, in lightness and in dark, in comfort and in struggle. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught Peter, saying to him, you have little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got in the boat, the wind ceased. When we are faced with the story of our lives, faced with an imminent crisis, the Christian response is not simply to be optimistic or to force some perspective of happiness. The faithful response is to trust that God will reach out God's hand in the good and the bad. Even in the most chaotic waters of life, faith is resting our hope that God will catch us. Friends, I can tell you stories of significance and emptiness, and those are absolutely natural poles of human experience. But the good news of the gospel is deeper. The good news that enfolds through all these moments of dark and light and joy and struggle, the good news that we proclaim when we come to this place is that God is on our side. Our failures, our questions, doubts, griefs, loss, none of it can separate us from God. Our successes, our joys, our accomplishments, our moments of control and wisdom, whether calm, whether flood, we are bound up in God's irresistible grace. And may we recognize that and celebrate that with praise and by reaching out toward one another. Amen.